topic is Big Coal, Australia's Dirtiest Habit, and the speakers are Professor David McKnight and Peter Colley. Dr. David McKnight is an academic at the University of New South Wales, and he co-authored Big Coal, Australia's Dirtiest Habit. He also wrote Rupert Murdoch, An Investigation of Political Power, and Beyond Right and Left on Renewing the Progressive Vision in Australia. David McKnight's going to speak first.
Welcome, everyone. Well, thank you, I should say. Last October, the Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, took the occasion of opening a new coal mine in Queensland to give us the benefit of his views on coal, on the coal industry. He called on Australians to stop demonising coal. He said, coal is good for humanity, coal is good for prosperity, coal is an essential part of our economic future here in Australia and right around the world. This comes after early attempts by his government to wipe out nearly all measures addressing the problem of global warming. At various times, the Abbott government has tried to abolish or fatally wound the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, the Climate Commission and the Climate Change Authority. His government's attitude to the renewable energy target was demonstrated by its appointment of a climate sceptic businessman, Dick Warburton, to review the renewable energy target, and that battle continues today. And while doing all of this, Tony Abbott, Greg Hunt and all other ministers say, with their hand on their heart, that they accept the climate science and they have the policies to deal with it. But we're here to talk about coal, in particular Big Coal, and as Mary said, that's the title of a book that I co-authored with Guy Pearce and Bob Burton. The event that inspired the book in 2010 occurred when the Rudd government tried to introduce the mining super profits tax. At that time, the mining industry was making extraordinary profits, and quite rightly, the government wanted more Australians to benefit. In response, the mining industry mounted a powerful and effective campaign against the tax. Among other things, we saw the normally reclusive Gina Rinehart jump on the back of a truck in Perth to lead a crowd of people chanting slogans against the tax. I suppose this incident was more comic relief, but the wider conflict that occurred was deadly serious. Shortly after the mining industry had beaten the government, the head of Rio Tinto said in London that what had happened should be a lesson to governments all around the world. Let me repeat that. The head of one of the biggest mining multinationals said that what had happened should be a lesson to governments all around the world if they tackle a big company like that. That's what they can expect. At this time when this occurred, and when I saw this display of raw power by mining corporations, something clicked for me. Here was a convincing explanation of the previous pussyfooting of governments in acting on climate change. I came to this conclusion also because previously, one year before the big clash over the Rudd's mining tax, the industry had exercised its powers and campaigned against the emissions trading scheme and helped make it impossible to support. And in 2011, a year after they beat the mining tax, the mining industry, of which the coal and the iron ore industry are the two key components, they campaigned against the introduction of a carbon tax. And in all these campaigns, as I say, the coal industry is absolutely central. When you hear mining industry, it's not, the core of it is iron ore and coal. They're the people who... You don't get BHP and Rio dirtying their own name. Of course, they've got fronts like the Minerals Council of Australia and other lobby groups to do this kind of campaigning. In their campaign against the carbon tax and the emissions trading scheme, the coal corporations routinely told lies. If an ETS or carbon tax was introduced, they said the sky would fall in. Mines would close, thousands of jobs would be lost. Well, no thanks to them, the carbon tax was introduced and mines actually expanded. And of the few that did close, not even the mining industry had the gall to claim that it was because of the carbon tax. Rather, everyone acknowledged that it was because of this beginning of the drop in the world price of coal and certain mines that coal was getting harder to get out and so on. But the mining industry has had a lot of success in convincing Australians that our good fortune in the global financial crisis and continuing today is due to the success of the mining industry. Any changes to the mining industry would damage Australia, they say. In the book I helped write, Big Coal, we examine these kind of claims. And we argue that the interests of Australia, surprise, surprise, are not the same as the interests of these mining companies. For starters, nearly all the major mining companies and all the big coal companies are either totally foreign-owned or foreign-dominated. The biggest coal mining companies, such as Xstrata, Peabody and Anglo-American, are 100% foreign-owned. Other giants are overwhelmingly in foreign hands. Rio Tinto is about 83% foreign-owned, BHP Billiton about 76%. And because overall the mining industry is about 80% foreign-owned, most profits eventually go offshore. And by the way, that's not, those figures and that analysis is not some wild calculation from someone like me. That's based on a Reserve Bank study. That's what they say about the profits in the industry. Some mining profits in the industry, of course, do stay in Australia, that's undeniable, and average Australians like Gina Reinhardt and Clive Palmer benefit from this. Another big claim by mining companies is that they provide a vast number of jobs. And again, this is highly misleading because coal mining, like most mining, has become increasingly mechanised. These are capital-intensive industries. While we were researching our book, coal mining employed, or rather there were 46,000 coal miners, which may sound significant. But in a workforce of over 11 million, it is really tiny, 46,000. To give you some idea of the number of coal miners, it's about a quarter of the jobs in the university and tertiary education sector. But the jobs argument is misleading in another way. The creation of jobs for Australians is supposed to justify the opening of new coal mines. But at the height of the recent coal boom in 2012, several big mining companies wanted to import large numbers of temporary foreign workers. As well, they're experimenting, and Peter probably knows this better than I, they've now got driverless trucks in many mines. So they portray themselves as wonderful charity organisations just busting to offer jobs to people. In fact, they're, as every industry does, they ruthlessly try to reduce and have the minimum number of workers in their employ. And in fact, a boom, or the boom we had in mining, can actually reduce unemployment. For example, the recent mining boom damaged other export industries because it drove up the value of the Australian dollar. So what the result of this is that Australian wheat, wool, manufactured exports were more expensive to overseas customers. A higher dollar jacks up the cost of fees that overseas students pay, so they're less likely to come here. It makes tourism in Australia from overseas more expensive, and that damages that industry as well. So while many of the supposed benefits of the mining boom are small or illusory, the damage is very real. And this is particularly true of coal, which is at the heart of the Australian mining industry. Having said all that, I'm not opposed to mining in general, but I am opposed to the idea that we can just go on mining coal forever. Because coal is a mineral like no other, and mining coal is an industry like no other. The reason is simply that burning coal is the largest single source of greenhouse gases in the world. Coal mining and burning coal has to be phased out because climate change can have potentially catastrophic effects. Many people still talk about the threat of climate change, but the changes are already happening before our eyes. The most dramatic recent evidence is the rapid shrinkage of the once vast Arctic ice sheet. In the northern summer of 2012, the size of the Arctic ice sheet sank to its lowest level on record. Scientific forecasts had previously predicted that basically it would disappear by the summer of 2050. But the current melting lends weight to the most pessimistic analyses of some time ago, which said that this might occur by the end of this decade. We won't know. The volume of ice has now come back a bit, but of course the trajectory is going down, down, down. So we've already changed one of the biggest physical features on the planet, and this physical feature, the Arctic ice sheet, plays a big role in the direction and temperature of global ocean currents and the world's weather. So the threat is not distant. It's not a threat that may happen. It's happening here and now. The sceptics like to point out that land temperatures have plateaued at a very high level. What they don't say is that the temperatures of the oceans have been rising continuously, and the shrinkage of the Arctic ice shelf may be one of the consequences of this. Other consequences of climate change are well established. If you go to Sydney Harbour, do a litmus test the way we all used to do in school, you get a little bit of paper, put it into the liquid. If you put a litmus paper into Sydney Harbour, it comes out redder than it used to because seawater is now 30% more acidic than in pre-industrial times. And more acid seawater makes it harder for coral to grow and for krill and shellfish to reproduce. Air temperatures are higher, generally speaking, and warm air traps more water vapour than cold, and our atmosphere is about 4 to 5% more moist than it was previously. And the result of that is, because the atmosphere is holding more moisture, we get drought and flood on a whole different scale. In sum, by continuing to burn coal and oil, we're messing around with the thin layer of the planet's surface, which supports life, and we're doing this recklessly and carelessly. One purpose of our book, Big Coal, was to ring the alarm bells about this situation. Another purpose was to contribute to the growing movement against the power of the big coal mining corporations. As I said earlier, when you're dealing with fossil fuel companies, you're dealing with some of the most powerful and ruthless corporations on the face of the earth. And when you're trying to beat them, when you're trying to deal with them, you have to have a counterforce to defeat them. You cannot defeat a powerful and wealthy group like the coal and oil industry unless you mobilise a counterforce. Rational arguments about science are useful. Identifying alternatives to coal-fired power is useful, and using the courts to mount challenges is also useful. Small activist actions can be useful, but each of these can be brushed aside. The only thing that ultimately counts, in my view, will be a very large and broad counterforce of people power to confront the power of the coal industry and to demand real action by governments on climate change. And this is one of the themes of Naomi Klein's recent book, This Changes Everything. She talks, I don't agree with everything she says, but she says the key to it is we still don't yet have a real social movement concerned about climate change and determined to fight against these big corporations. So in the last few minutes of what I want to say, I just want to talk about this. We don't really have, or a really powerful and broad movement hasn't emerged, and it's worth thinking about why that is. My own background is not in the environment movement, but one thing that struck me as I've become more and more interested in these questions in the last few years is the extraordinary degree of fragmentation and disunity amongst those who are worried about climate change. Each group focuses on its own patch and its own factional territory. There seems to be no sense of a common purpose, or even perhaps of the need to develop a common purpose. To build an active counterforce of people requires, in my view, a lot more unity. It requires activist groups to not only join with other activists, but also to seek out non-activist organisations. For instance, churches, trade unions, scientists, and together try and forge a new kind of broad mass movement. I say this because while all successful social changes begin with committed activists, to succeed they usually have to transcend this. If the activists can find a way to build a broadly based movement which allows us place for the vast number of people who understand climate change but who are not themselves activists, they may be able to succeed beyond their wildest dreams. When a similar broadly based movement emerged in New York last year in September, 300,000 people came onto the streets. It was unprecedented. I think the same could be done in Australia, but again we have this kind of factionalised, fragmented movement, all kinds of people concerned about the issue, but there's been no catalyst to bring people together. And finally, I think one of the Abbott government's weakest points is its hostility to action on climate change, and targeting this should be a priority for all who genuinely want action against the growing dangers of climate change. Thanks very much.